April 15, 1945. British forces pushed through the gates of Bergen-Belsen concentration camp in northern Germany. They expect something terrible. They've heard rumors, reports, whispers from the front lines, but nothing prepares them for what they find. Tens of thousands of corpses, piled in mass graves, scattered across the ground like discarded objects. Survivors so emaciated they look like walking skeletons. Disease everywhere, typhus, dysentery, starvation, the smell of death so thick in the air that soldiers vomit behind their tanks. And standing calmly among this nightmare, 3 women, young, wearing SS uniforms, showing no fear, no remorse, no emotion at all. One of them is 21 years old, blonde, pretty. She has a whip coiled at her belt and a pistol on her hip. Her name is Irma Grese, and the prisoners who survived her will testify that she was one of the most sadistic guards they had ever encountered. That she smiled while people died. That she enjoyed it. Before we go any further, I need you to do something. Leave a comment right now and tell me where you're watching from. I want to see how many countries are here with me on this. And if you haven't subscribed yet, do it now, because this is a story that was buried for decades, and it's one you need to hear. Now, let's go back. Back to that moment when British soldiers entered Belsen. Back to the question that haunted every single one of them. How does a young woman become this? How does someone who looks like she could be your sister, your daughter, your neighbor? How does she become a killer? The answer is not simple. And that's exactly what makes it so terrifying. Irma Grese was born October 7, 1923, in a small farming community called Rieschen in northeastern Germany. A normal town, a normal family. 5 children. Her father was a farm worker, unremarkable. Her mother suffered from depression and died when Irma was 13. Some say suicide, though records are unclear. Irma left school at 14. She worked briefly in a shop, then at a dairy farm. Then she became interested in nursing. She applied to a hospital, hoping to train as a nurse. The hospital required 2 years of agricultural labor as prerequisite. She agreed. She worked at an SS agricultural station. And that's where everything changed. Because at that SS facility, she was introduced to Nazi ideology, racial purity, the superiority of the Aryan race, the idea that some lives were worth more than others, that eliminating the weak, the inferior, the undesirable was not just acceptable, it was a duty. And Irma Grese, a young woman with no real education, no strong family foundation, no clear direction in life, she absorbed it completely. She believed it. And more than that, she wanted to be part of it. In 1942, at age 18, she applied to join the SS Auxiliary. She didn't have to. This was voluntary. Women were not conscripted into the SS camp system. They applied. They chose to be there. And Irma Grese chose. She was accepted. She was sent for training. And in August 1942, she arrived at Auschwitz-Birkenau, the largest extermination camp in Nazi-occupied Europe, a place where over 1 million people would be murdered. And Irma Grese walked through those gates willingly, ready to do her job. At first, she was assigned to the women's camp at Birkenau, a junior guard, 19 years old, barely older than some of the prisoners. But she rose quickly, promoted within months, given authority over thousands of women. And here's what the survivors say, that she didn't just follow orders, that she went beyond them, that she seemed to enjoy the power, the control, the fear she could create with just a look, a word, a crack of her whip. She carried a plated whip, leather. She used it constantly, on prisoners in roll call, on women too weak to stand, on anyone who moved too slowly, spoke too loudly, looked at her the wrong way. Survivors described her walking through the camp with her, whip in hand, her dog at her side, a German shepherd she had trained to attack on command. She would set the dog on prisoners. She would watch as they were mauled, and she would smile. But it wasn't just physical violence. It was psychological torture. She conducted selections, deciding who would live and who would be sent to the gas chambers. She walked the rows of women, pointing left or right with casual indifference. Left meant forced labor, right meant death. And she did this without hesitation, without emotion, like she was sorting livestock. One survivor, Gisela Pearl, a Jewish doctor who worked in the camp, testified later that Irma Grese would appear during medical inspections, beautiful and immaculate in her uniform, and point out women who were sick or weak. Those women would disappear, sent to Block 25, the holding block for the gas chambers. Pearl described Grese as the most beautiful woman I ever saw, and the most demonic. Another survivor, Olga Lengyel, recalled how Grese would stand at the gates during new arrivals, how she would watch families being separated, mothers torn from children, husbands from wives, and how Grese would laugh. Not loud, not theatrical, just a quiet, cold amusement, like she was watching something entertaining. Here's what makes this so disturbing. Irma Grese was not a high-ranking Nazi official. She wasn't an ideologue giving speeches. She wasn't a camp commandant making policy. She was a god, a young woman with a whip and a uniform. And she chose, every single day, to inflict maximum suffering. Not because she was ordered to, but because she could. And she wasn't alone. Elizabeth Volkenrath, born September 5, 1919 in Schonau under Katzbach, Lower Silesia. Tall, stern, methodical. She started as a hairdresser. Then she joined the SS in 1941, also voluntarily. She was assigned to Auschwitz-Birkenau in October 1942. By 1944, she was the Oberaufseherin, the highest-ranking female guard in the camp. She oversaw thousands of women prisoners. She conducted selections. She supervised punishments. And survivors testified that she was ruthless, cold, efficient. She didn't need to shout or use a whip like Grese. She just watched. And her silence was terrifying. One prisoner recalled Volkenrath standing in the camp during a selection, clipboard in hand, marking down numbers with the same expression someone might use while doing inventory at a warehouse. No anger, no hatred, just nothing. And that emptiness, that total lack of empathy, was what made her so dangerous. Then there was Johanna Bormann, older, born in 1893, a generation older than Grese. She had worked in multiple camps, Ravensbrück, Auschwitz, Bergen-Belsen. She was known for something specific, her dog, a massive German Shepherd mix that she trained to attack prisoners on command. Survivors called her the woman with the dogs. She would walk through the camp with the animal at her side, and if anyone stepped out of line, she would release it. The dog would tear into them while Bormann stood and watched. Sometimes she would call it off. Sometimes she wouldn't. What did these three women have in common? They were not forced into this. They were not coerced. They volunteered. They climbed the ranks. They took pride in their work. And when the war turned and Germany began to lose, they didn't defect. They didn't hide. They stayed at their posts, doing their jobs until the very end. In January 1945, as Soviet forces closed in on Auschwitz, the SS began evacuating the camp. Thousands of prisoners were forced on death marches westward. Irma Grese was transferred to Bergen-Belsen. So was Elizabeth Volkenrath. So was Johanna Bormann. Bergen-Belsen wasn't an extermination camp like Auschwitz. It was a holding camp. But by early 1945, it had become a death trap, overcrowded, no food, no sanitation, typhus spreading like wildfire, prisoners dying by the thousands. And still, these women kept working, still enforcing discipline, still punishing, still selecting who would receive food and who wouldn't. And then came April 15th, 1945. British forces arrived. The camp was in chaos. Bodies everywhere. The living barely distinguishable from the dead. And there, standing at their posts, were Irma Grese, Elizabeth Volkenrath, Johanna Bormann, and dozens of other SS guards. They didn't run. They didn't try to escape. They were simply there, waiting, as if they expected to go on as normal. The British soldiers were in shock. They had liberated other camps. They had seen war, but nothing prepared them for Belgium. One soldier, Lieutenant Colonel Mervyn Gonin, wrote in his diary, The camp was so full because people had been brought there from other camps. Some had marched for days. Many died on the way. The living lay side by side with the dead. It was beyond comprehension, and when the British began arresting the SS guards, they found something strange. Many of the guards seemed surprised, indignant even, like they had done nothing wrong, like this was just a job. One guard, when questioned, said simply, "I was only following orders." It became the default defense, the standard line, but the evidence told a different story. Because survivors began to speak. Prisoners who had lived through Auschwitz and Belsen started identifying guards, pointing them out, naming them. And the names that came up again and again were Irma Grese, Elizabeth Volkenrath, and Johanna Bormann. The British decided to hold a trial. The Belsen trial, it was called. It began on September 17, 1945, in Lüneburg, Germany. 45 defendants, guards, SS officers, capos, prisoners who had collaborated, and among them, 11 women. The courtroom was packed. Journalists from around the world, photographers, allied officers, and sitting in the dock expressionless were the 3 women who had terrorized thousands. The testimonies were devastating. Survivor after survivor took the stand, describing beatings, starvation, selections, dogs, whips, deaths, and every time a survivor pointed to one of the women and said, "That one, she did this to me," the women showed nothing. No guilt, no remorse. Irma Grese sat calmly, occasionally glancing at her fingernails. Elizabeth Volkenrath stared straight ahead. Johanna Bormann looked bored. One survivor, Hanke Rosenweg, testified that she saw Irma Grese beat a prisoner so severely with her whip that the woman died on the spot. Another, Ilona Stein, described how Grese set her dog on a group of women who had tried to take extra food. The dog mauled one woman's leg so badly it had to be amputated without anesthesia. Dr. Ada Binko, a Polish Jewish doctor who had worked in the camps, testified about Volkenrath's role in selections. How she would stand with a clipboard, deciding fates with a flick of her pen. How she never hesitated, never showed doubt. And witness after witness described Johanna Bormann's dog. How it was trained to attack on command. How prisoners would freeze in terror when they heard it barking. How Bormann seemed to take pleasure in the fear. The defense tried to argue that these women were following orders, that they had no choice, that the SS command structure left no room for disobedience. But the prosecution countered with a simple fact. These women volunteered. They applied for these positions. They requested transfers to camps. They were not conscripts. They were willing participants. And there was another problem with the defense. Evidence showed that these women went beyond their orders, that they acted with personal cruelty, that they enjoyed the power, that they chose to inflict suffering when they didn't have to. The trial lasted nearly 2 months. On November 17, 1945, the verdicts were read. Guilty, Irma Grese. Guilty of crimes against humanity, Elizabeth Volkenrath. Guilty, Johanna Bormann. Guilty. All 3 sentenced to death by hanging. Irma Grese was 22 years old. The executions were set for December 13, 1945, at Hameln prison in Germany. In the days leading up to the execution, Grese was interviewed by a British chaplain. He later said she showed no remorse, that she believed she had done her duty, that she seemed more concerned about how she would be remembered than about the lives she had destroyed. On the morning of December 13th, the 3 women were led to the gallows. Irma Grese went first. She walked calmly. Reportedly, her last words were spoken in German to the hangman. Schnell, quick. The trapdoor opened. She dropped. She was dead within seconds. Elizabeth Volkenrath followed, then Johanna Bormann. All 3 executed before noon. They were among the first women executed for war crimes in modern history, and their deaths marked something important. They proved that gender was no defense, that being a woman did not exempt someone from responsibility for atrocity, that cruelty has no gender. But here's the question that haunted the trial and haunts us still. How did this happen? How did 3 ordinary women, A farm girl, a hairdresser, a working-class housewife become killers, the answer is uncomfortable. Because it suggests that under the right circumstances, with the right ideology, the right structure, and the right incentives, ordinary people can commit extraordinary evil. Irma Grese didn't start as a sadist. She started as a teenage girl looking for purpose, for belonging, for power in a world that offered women very little of it. The Nazi system gave her that. It told her she was superior. It gave her a uniform, a whip, authority over thousands. It rewarded cruelty and punished compassion. And she adapted. She thrived. Elisabeth Volkenroth wasn't born cold. She became cold. The system demanded efficiency. It demanded obedience. It demanded that she see prisoners not as people but as numbers, as problems to be managed. And she learned to do that. She learned to turn off empathy like a switch. Johanna Bormann didn't inherently enjoy violence, but the system normalized it. It made violence routine, expected, even celebrated. And over time, what once might have horrified her became just another part of the job. This is what systems do. They don't require monsters. They create them. They take ordinary people and give them extraordinary power. They remove accountability. They dehumanize the victims. And they reward those who comply. And here's the truly terrifying part. Irma Grese, Elisabeth Volkenroth, and Johanna Bormann were not exceptions. They were not rare. There were hundreds of female SS guards in the Nazi camp system. Most of them were never caught, never tried, never punished. They went home after the war, changed their names, lived normal lives, and died of old age, never facing justice. The 3 women who were hanged at Hamel were unlucky. Not because they were innocent, but because they were caught. But let's go deeper, because there's more to this story. More details that make it even more chilling. Let's talk about what daily life looked like under these women. What it meant to be a prisoner in a camp where Irma Grese walked the grounds. Morning roll call at Auschwitz-Birkenau began before dawn. Prisoners would stand in rows for hours, regardless of weather. Rain, snow, freezing cold, summer heat. They stood, and Irma Grese would walk the rows with her whip. She would inspect them, look for any imperfection, a stain on a uniform, a posture that wasn't straight enough, a face that showed too much exhaustion. And she would strike, fast, without warning. The whip would crack across a back, a face, an arm, and the prisoner would have to remain standing, silent, because crying out meant more punishment. One survivor, Kitty Hart-Moxon, described a morning when Grese beat a woman so badly during roll call that she collapsed. The woman was left lying on the ground for the entire roll call. Hours. No one was allowed to help her. When roll call finally ended, the woman was dead. Grese stepped over the body and walked away, like it was nothing. Another survivor, Anita Lasker-Wolfish, who played cello in the women's orchestra at Auschwitz, recalled seeing Grese almost daily. The orchestra would play during roll call, during selections, during punishments. And Grese would sometimes stop and listen. She liked music. She would stand there, tapping her foot to the rhythm, whip in hand, while prisoners were being beaten or led to the gas chambers, just meters away. The juxtaposition was surreal, horrifying, music and death, beauty and brutality, all coexisting in the same moment. Grese also had a reputation for her appearance. She was vain. She kept her uniform immaculate, her hair perfectly styled, her boots polished to a shine. Survivors remember this detail because it stood in such stark contrast to their own condition. They were starving, filthy, lice-infested, dying, and she looked like she had stepped out of a fashion magazine. It was a deliberate choice, a display of power. She was showing them that she was human and they were not, that she had value and they did not. There are accounts of Grese conducting what she called inspections in the barracks. She would enter unannounced, usually at night. She would demand that prisoners stand at attention, and then she would go through their belongings. Not looking for contraband, just looking for an excuse. A piece of bread hidden under a mattress, a scrap of cloth used as a bandage, anything, And if she found something, the punishment was brutal. Beatings, starvation rations, assignment to the hardest labor details. Sometimes, if she was in a particularly cruel mood, she would simply select women at random and send them to Block 25. No reason, just because she could. Elizabeth Volkenroth operated differently. She was more bureaucratic, more systematic. She didn't use a whip. She didn't need to. Her power came from her position. As Oberofficerin, she controlled the entire structure of the women's camp. She decided work assignments. She decided food rations. She decided punishments. And she wielded this power with cold precision. Survivors describe her as someone who never raised her voice, who never showed emotion. She would issue orders in a flat, matter-of-fact tone. And those orders would be carried out immediately. Because everyone knew that disobedience meant death, not dramatic death. Not a public beating, just disappearance. You would be taken away, sent somewhere, and you would never come back. One former prisoner, Helen Stone, testified at the trial that Volkenroth once ordered an entire barracks to be cleared because one woman had been caught with an extra piece of bread. The entire barracks, over 200 women, all sent to Block 25, all gassed within days. Volkenroth gave the order without hesitation. Without explanation, it was collective punishment. And it was designed to create terror, to make prisoners understand that their survival depended not just on their own behavior, but on everyone around them. It turned prisoners against each other, made them informants, made them complicit. Volkenroth also oversaw the selections. Not just the selections at the ramp when new transports arrived, but the regular selections inside the camp. Every few weeks, prisoners would be lined up. SS doctors would walk through, and Volkenroth would be there with her clipboard, taking notes. Women who were too sick, too weak, too injured to work were marked down. And within days, they would be gone. It was efficient, methodical, industrial. And here's what makes Volkenroth's story particularly disturbing. After the war, during her interrogation, she expressed no understanding of why she was being prosecuted. She insisted she had been doing her job, that she had followed regulations, that she had maintained order. She genuinely seemed to believe that she was blameless, that the system was responsible, not her. Even when confronted with testimony from survivors, even when shown evidence of her actions, she remained detached, cold, uncomprehending. Johanna Bormann's cruelty was more visceral, more immediate. She was older than the other two. She had been in the camp system longer, and she had learned that fear was the most effective tool of control. Her dog was an extension of that fear. Prisoners called the dog the man-eater. It was huge, aggressive, trained to attack on command. And Bormann would use it, constantly. One survivor, Yvette Levy, described an incident where Bormann released her dog on a group of women who had been caught stealing potato peels from the kitchen. The dog attacked one woman, tearing into her leg and arm. The woman screamed, begged for help, and Bormann just stood there, holding the leash, watching. Other guards eventually pulled the dog off. But the woman's injuries were so severe that she died days later from infection. Bormann faced no consequences. It was considered a legitimate use of force. Another survivor recalled seeing Bormann walk through the camp every morning with the dog at her side. The mere sight of her caused panic. Women would scramble to get out of her way, press themselves against walls, freeze in place. Because if you moved wrong, if you drew her attention, she might set the dog loose. And there was no predicting when she would do it. Sometimes she would walk past without incident. Other times she would stop, point at someone, and give the command. It was random, arbitrary, designed to maximize fear. Bormann also had a habit of selecting prisoners for what she called exercise. She would take a group of women to an open area and order them to run back and forth for hours, in the heat, without water. And if anyone slowed down, if anyone collapsed, she would set the dog on them. It was torture disguised as discipline, and she did it regularly. Now, let's talk about something that often gets overlooked in discussions of these. Women, their relationships with male SS officers and guards. because the camp system was not just a hierarchy of rank. It was also a social environment. Guards lived on site. They had barracks, mess halls, recreational areas. They had relationships, friendships, romances, and the female guards existed within this structure. Irma Grese was known to have had affairs with several SS officers. One of them was Joseph Kramer, the commandant of Bergen-Belsen. Another was Joseph Mengele, the infamous angel of death who conducted horrific medical experiments at Auschwitz. These relationships gave her influence, protection, and they reinforced her status within the camp hierarchy. She wasn't just a guard. She was connected, valued, untouchable. But these relationships also reveal something about how the SS system functioned. It wasn't just about following orders. It was about belonging to a community that had its own rules, its own values, its own social norms. And within that community, cruelty was normal, expected, even admired. Guards who were tough on prisoners were respected, promoted, rewarded. Those who showed mercy were seen as weak, unreliable, a liability. Survivors described social events where guards would gather, parties, dinners, celebrations, and they would laugh, tell jokes, talk about their day like office workers discussing routine tasks. Except their tasks involved selecting people for death, supervising forced labor, beating prisoners. And this was just normal part of the job. Nothing to feel bad about. This normalization of violence is one of the most disturbing aspects of the camp system. It shows how quickly atrocity can become routine, how ordinary people can adapt to extraordinary evil, how a system can reshape morality itself. And it wasn't just the guards. The entire Nazi state was structured to normalize genocide. Propaganda portrayed Jews, Roma, political prisoners, and other targeted groups as subhuman, as threats, as vermin that needed to be eliminated. This dehumanization was systematic. It was taught in schools, broadcast on radio, printed in newspapers, and it worked. It convinced millions of people that mass murder was not just acceptable, but necessary. Irma Grese, Elisabeth Volkenrath, and Johanna Bormann were products of the system. They absorbed its values, internalized its logic, and acted accordingly. But here's the critical point. They were not passive. They were not mindless automatons. They made choices. Every day, they chose cruelty over compassion. They chose power over mercy. They chose to be part of the machine. And when the machine collapsed, when Germany lost the war and the camps were liberated, they faced a reckoning. But even then, their responses revealed who they had become. During the Belsen trial, the prosecution presented overwhelming evidence. Survivor testimony, documents, photographs. The defendants were given every opportunity to defend themselves, to explain their actions, to show remorse, and most of them refused. Irma Grese's defense attorney tried to argue that she was young, impressionable, that she had been manipulated by older, more powerful SS officers. But when Grese took the stand, she undermined her own defense. She spoke clearly, confidently. She admitted to hitting prisoners. She admitted to conducting selections. But she insisted she was only following orders, that she had no choice. When asked if she felt any guilt, she said no. When asked if she understood that her actions had caused immense suffering, she said that prisoners were criminals and enemies of the state, and that they deserved their treatment. The courtroom was silent. Even her own attorney seemed stunned, because in that moment, Grese revealed that she hadn't changed, that she still believed in what she had done, that she still saw herself as justified. Elisabeth Volkenrath's testimony was even more chilling. She was calm, composed. She answered questions in a monotone. She confirmed her role. She confirmed her actions. And when asked if she felt responsible for the deaths of thousands of women, she said simply, "I was following regulations. I was maintaining order. That was my duty." No emotion. No recognition of the horror she had caused. Just bureaucratic detachment. Johanna Bormann initially tried to deny everything. She claimed she had only been a guard, that she had never harmed anyone, that she had never used her dog to attack prisoners. But Survivor after survivor identified her, described specific incidents, pointed her out in the courtroom, and eventually, confronted with overwhelming evidence, she changed her story. She admitted to having a dog. She admitted to releasing it on prisoners, but she claimed it was for security, that prisoners were dangerous, that she was protecting herself and other guards. The judges didn't believe her. The verdicts were announced on November 17, 1945. The courtroom was packed. Survivors sat in the gallery, journalists filled the press section. Allied officers stood along the walls. And as each verdict was read, the defendants showed different reactions. When Irma Grese heard guilty and death by hanging, she didn't flinch. She stared straight ahead, expressionless, like she had expected it. Like it didn't matter. When Elizabeth Volkenrath heard the same verdict, she closed her eyes briefly. But when she opened them, her face was blank again. No tears, no protest. Just acceptance. When Johanna Bormann heard her verdict, she swayed slightly. For a moment, it looked like she might collapse. But she steadied herself, and then she sat down, staring at the floor. 11 people were sentenced to death in the Belsen trial. 8 men, 3 women. The executions were scheduled for December 13, 1945. They would be carried out by Albert Pierrepoint, Britain's chief executioner. He had hanged over 200 people during his career. But this would be his first mass execution of war criminals, and his first time executing women. In the weeks leading up to the execution, the condemned were held at Hamon prison. They were kept in separate cells, allowed 1 hour of exercise per day, given basic meals, and visited regularly by chaplains and medical staff. The chaplain who spoke with Irma Grese later wrote about his interactions with her. He said she was polite, cooperate, but utterly unrepentant. She spent her time writing letters, reading, keeping her cell tidy. She asked for makeup and a mirror. She was concerned about her appearance, about how she would look when she died. The chaplain tried to talk to her about guilt, about the lives she had destroyed, about seeking forgiveness. She listened politely, and then changed the subject. Elizabeth Volkenrath, according to prison records, spent most of her time silent. She didn't write letters, didn't talk much to guards or chaplains. She just sat in her cell, staring at the wall. When asked if she wanted anything, she would shake her head. When asked if she wanted to make a statement or confession, she declined. She seemed to have withdrawn completely into herself. Johanna Bormann was the most distressed. She cried frequently. She wrote letters to her family. She asked repeatedly if there was any chance of clemency. The answer was always no. She tried to argue that she had been following orders, that she didn't deserve death. But the evidence against her was overwhelming. And unlike Grese and Volkenrath, who seemed to have accepted their fates, Bormann remained desperate until the end. On the morning of December 13, 1945, at approximately 9 a.m., the executions began. The gallows had been constructed in the prison courtyard. There were 2 traps. This meant 2 people could be hanged simultaneously. Pierrepoint had designed the process to be as efficient as possible. Each execution would take less than 10 seconds from the moment the condemned entered the execution chamber to the moment the trap dropped. Irma Grese was scheduled to be first. At 9:34 a.m., guards entered her cell. She was dressed in her own clothing, a dark skirt and light blouse. Her hair was neat. She had applied makeup. She walked calmly to the execution chamber. Witnesses reported that she showed no fear, no hesitation. She climbed the steps to the gallows. Pierrepoint placed the noose around her neck, asked if she had any last words. She looked at him and said in German, "Quick." Pierrepoint stepped back, pulled the lever. The trap dropped. Irma Grese was dead within seconds. She was 22 years old. Elizabeth Volkenrath was next. She was hanged at 10:03 a.m. She walked to the gallows without assistance, said nothing, showed no emotion. The execution was quick, efficient. She was 26 years old. Johanna Bormann was hanged at 10:38 a.m. She had to be partially carried to the gallows. She was crying, shaking, but she didn't resist. The noose was placed. The trap dropped. She was 52 years old. Bye. Noon, all 11 condemned prisoners had been executed. Their bodies were taken down, placed in coffins, buried in unmarked graves, no memorials, no headstones, just anonymous burial in a prison cemetery. And that was the end of Irma Grese, Elisabeth Volkenrath, and Johanna Bormann. But not the end of their story, because their trial set a precedent. It established that gender was no excuse for war crimes, that women could be held accountable for atrocities just as men could. This was revolutionary. Up until that point, most legal systems treated women differently, assumed they were less capable of violence, less responsible for their actions. The Belgian trial destroyed that assumption. It also raised uncomfortable questions about female participation in genocide, because these women were not anomalies. Across Nazi-occupied Europe, thousands of women worked in the camp system, as guards, as administrators, as nurses in euthanasia programs, as secretaries who typed deportation orders, as wives of SS officers who lived in houses next to camps and benefited from stolen Jewish property. The myth of women as inherently peaceful, inherently moral, inherently incapable of such cruelty, it was shattered. But here's what's particularly disturbing. After the war, many female guards simply disappeared. They went home, changed their names, got married, had children, lived normal lives, and most were never caught, never prosecuted, never faced justice. Estimates suggest that fewer than 10% of female SS guards were ever tried for war crimes. The rest got away with it. Why? Because post-war authorities focused primarily on male perpetrators, on camp commandants, on SS officers, on the architects of the final solution. Female guards were often seen as secondary, less important, and many slipped through the cracks. There's also another factor: gender bias in the justice system. Many people simply couldn't believe that women were capable of such cruelty. Witnesses would testify about beatings, torture, murders committed by female guards, and prosecutors would struggle to convince judges and juries that these testimonies were credible, because it didn't fit the narrative, the story people wanted to believe, that women were victims of war, not perpetrators. This bias persisted for decades. Even now, when we talk about Nazi atrocities, we focus overwhelmingly on men: Himmler, Eichmann, Mengele, the male guards, the male commandants. And we forget about the women, the thousands of women who participated, who made choices, who inflicted suffering. And this forgetting is dangerous, because it perpetuates the myth that women are incapable of such violence, that they are somehow morally superior, that they can be trusted in ways men cannot. And that myth makes us vulnerable, because the lesson of Irma Grese, Elisabeth Volkenrath, and Johanna Bormann is not that women are evil. It's that anyone can become complicit in evil, given the right circumstances, the right ideology, the right incentives. Anyone. So what do we do with this story? How do we remember women like this? Should we remember them at all? Or does remembering them give them the infamy they might have wanted? Let me know what you think in the comments. Some historians argue that we should focus on the victims, that perpetrators don't deserve our attention, that by studying them, analyzing them, trying to understand them, we're giving them more space in history than they deserve. And there's truth to that. The victims are the ones who matter. Their stories, their suffering, their resilience. That's what we should remember. But I would argue that we need to remember the perpetrators too, not to glorify them, not to humanize them in a way that excuses their actions, but to understand how ordinary people become killers, because that understanding is our only defense against it happening again. The Holocaust didn't happen because of a few evil individuals. It happened